do. Moreover, I think the interplay between these two poles and the swaying significations between conviction and instability is perhaps representative of why the word crisis has long been so important for how we think through our positions in society, in a community, and as historical agents. I think crisis leads to the need for definitive action in the future. And I think it's that relationship between our modern connotations of crisis and that ancient Greek sense of definitiveness that really play out in the word crisis, as I understand it. Just last week, Homi K. Bhabha, the eminent theorist, was speaking at the University of Oxford, in which he draws on the impact of current events on his thinking. And he notes that, to quote him, the anxious unpreparedness that drives freedom to reach its future moment is something that he thinks we need to be considering more when grappling with what's happening today. And I think this notion connects well to the ways in which I understand crisis. The idea that a crisis is a moment of ostensible uncertainty, which, if correctly reckoned with, can change the status quo and lead to an alternative reality. This very sense of uncertainty is one which plagues Cyprus, a site of conflict and division since the 1950s, if not earlier. To offer a very brief summary of its history, it was part of the British Empire from 1878 until 1960. And throughout the 50s, there was guerrilla warfare on the island against colonial rule. And after independence, there was intercommunal conflict between Greek speakers and Turkish speakers, which, among other political factors, too many to note right now, led to the partition of the island in 1974, which remains for all intents and purposes unresolved, bar some minor changes in and around 2003. And I think this uncertainty which affects the island is not unconnected with some of today's politics, which I've been discussing. I think that's really the importance of why I wanted to bring what's happening today into my discussion, because the roots of the crises, the instability, the unpreparedness that the Cypriots have faced on the island has its roots in Western imperialism. The two authors I will begin discussing in more detail now were living in a moment of intense crisis for Cyprus, the years immediately before and after independence in 1960. And each author wanted to harness this uncertainty in order to respond to the deaths of Cypriots at the hands of British colonizers who were being described as Oriental savages. And they wanted to do so in order to fight for justice in the medium they ultimately chose, which was literature. So what are these two works? One is Plucked in a Far Off Land by Taner Beybars, who happens to be a Cypriot from a Turkish-speaking background, and the other is Closed Doors by Kostas Montis, who happens to be a Cypriot who happened to be a Cypriot from a Greek-speaking background. The former writer spent his entire literary career composing works in English, whereas the latter composed works in Greek. Both, however, construct these particular prose texts, which, tied to what I've already said, draw on personal experiences, personal existential crises, in order to understand the political crisis of Cyprus moving from a period of colonization to independence, as well as confronting the nationalisms, including those of Greece and Turkey, which were in different ways, in very complex ways, involved in the intercommunal conflict on the island. Despite differences in the author's linguistic backgrounds and indeed the linguistic mediums of both their works, what I'm attempting to establish in my research is the ways in which stylistic and thematic parallels between these two particular writers give evidence, I think, of an attempt to consciously foster a shared cultural movement, which was particularly facilitated as a literary reaction to the very pressures of the crisis through which Beybars and Montis were living in. The two have composed Bildungsroman-like texts, which draw on their own experiences as young people navigating the pressures of empire nationalism on the island. Both were forced to flee the island at various moments in their lives. Taner Beybars never permanently returned to Cyprus, and Cyprus, up to 1974, a quarter of the island's population became refugees and internally displaced people. That too is one of the kind of crises that are affecting these texts. And going back to these works, these buildings remand like texts, paint very similar images, I think, drawing on, for instance, the destructiveness inflicted by the English language on the English language of British colonialism on the island. I think to anchor this back to what I was saying about the etymology of crisis and why I wanted to spend some time considering that, the two have responded to the contemporary instability of the island by offering literature which by representing the lives of Cypriots caught up in these conflicts for the very first time in its history, by giving literary voice to Cypriots, aimed to put forward an alternative reality beyond conflict and oppression by formulating a decisive literary action in response to the crisis in which they lived. I'm slightly conscious of the time I have left, but I wanted to offer an example of the kind of thematic parallels that the two writers have, and that is their depictions of the English language, these very metatextual depictions of English language within their works, again, despite linguistic differences in the mediums that they employ as writers. In Kostas Montis' Closed Doors, for instance, English and the British Empire is frequently figured in terms of, quote, the game of divide and rule. And that's his sense of what's happening with the English language on the island. At one point in the text, he notes that, quote, there was a war against the English language, against English road signs and other aspects of English infrastructure. He goes on to say that the war was to completely eliminate English from our lives. I use this quotation to offer an example of the way in which the English language is viewed as a medium through which violence is being inflicted on the island, and it's a colonialist violence against the indigenous islanders, but it's also a language which, through this game of divide and rule that he cites, is inciting sectarian division among the linguistic communities on the island. And I think what he's attempting to do in his work is to really show that the complex nuances of what's going on in terms of linguistic identifications, the power and the divisiveness of languages at this particular time. And for all these reasons, Kostas Montis chooses to defiantly write in the Greek language and to write against the English language, which had been the official language of the island until 1960. I don't really have time to talk about it in too much detail, but there are interesting moments in the text where he suddenly shifts to an English loanword in the Roman script before, in parentheses, saying, and here's an example, I use this English word here because it's weighed down in so much pain without any equivalence in Greek or indeed any equivalence in Turkish. One of those words, for example, is curfew. And of course, in America at the moment, curfews are being employed by the government there. He uses these words that are the tools of the English language that invade his island, invade his text, and he paints them in these kind of depictions of otherness to suggest that these words have a kind of pain, to quote him, that his first language or his mother tongue doesn't quite have. So I want to compare this briefly with Taner Beybars, and he does something very similar in terms of his representations of English. Throughout his text, he depicts English as something which is cutting the island. He suggests that English is creating a dividing line between the indigenous communities of Cypriots. He says that at school, to quote him, English words were gradually cutting into my tongue. Later on, he suggests that when he goes to watch American Hollywood productions in the island's first cinema, that those pictures, quote, were moving across the screen like a pair of scissors. I won't say too much more about that, but and the way in which that attempts to represent how Anglophone colonialisms, including American neo-colonial cultural imperialism, are involved in kind of these violent acts of cutting up the third world. But I would rather say a little bit more about the way in which he positions this as a form of cutting between the island's linguistic communities who were speaking Greek and Turkish. At one point, for instance, because of the Anglophone nature of British colonial education, he notes that throughout his early years, he had never seen a Greek textbook, and he'd only spoken and heard a few odd words. he notes that the first time that he encounters a Greek textbook, that was a new, wonderful experience, in contradistinction to the cutting force of English colonialism. And so I think what's going on there is the way in which languages are being personified, characterized in really complex ways, to show both the violence of different linguistic forms and the way in which counter linguistic forms and counter modes of education are able to bring communities together. And so I suppose, to sum this all up and to bring this to a close, both Montis and Baybars are responding to political crises that they have been experiencing on a personal level, which they understand fundamentally as having a linguistic component. These political crises manifest themselves through language, the language of colonialism, and I haven't had enough time to talk about this, but also the language of counteracting nationalist forces on the island. And so for both these writers, literature is I think the most crucial way for them to grapple with these crises, because they are able to formulate this decisive form, this decisive medium that allows them some agency over the languages which have, for the past century, made colonialist claims on the island. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Annunziata. Enjoy the silent applause there, I hope. Thank you very much for a really exciting, interesting presentation, and look forward to getting the opportunity to ask some questions a little bit later on. So thank you very much. All right, we'll now move on to introduce our second speaker, Danielle Cameron. So Danielle Cameron's presentation is titled "Our Life Partners in Conversation, Fellow Travelers in the Storm, Understanding Adult-Child Relationships and the US-Mexico Border Crisis in Valeria Luiselli's Lost Children Archive." Danielle Cameron is a PhD student at the University of East Anglia. Her thesis examines the relationship between aging, power, and narrative construction in post-1970 American literature, with a particular focus on the works of Colson Whitehead, Jennifer Egan, Paul Auster, and Don DeLillo. Her wider research interests include depictions of children and families in literature, spatial theory, and life writing. Prior to commencing her PhD, Danielle worked in postgraduate support at the London School of Economics and SOAS. Her writing appears in the European Journal of American Culture and Dear Movies. Danielle, it's an honor to hand over to you as our second speaker of the day.
Thank you. Just a heads up, it appears a tree surgeon is working on my road today, so I apologise for any noise interference you may experience. I also just get my presentation up. Hopefully, if you can just give it, if you can see it clearly, that would be great. Just 1 second. So can we see it okay before I go into full screen? Cool. Okay, so I begin with a very simple observation. Reading Valeria Luiselli's 2019 Lost Children Archive is difficult. Luiselli's reflections on the US-Mexico border crisis, the American government and media's treatment of child refugees, paired with her use of polyvocality and multimodality, result in an emotionally and formally complex work. Its central narrative follows a young family learning of the escalating crisis at the border while driving from Manhattan to Arizona. As they head south, the family listened to the radio and its coverage of hundreds of children arriving in America alone every day, thousands every week, fleeing from terror and poverty south of the US border. The family's movements across America eerily inverts the children's fraught northern trajectory and cause the family's matriarch, referred to as Ma or Mama throughout, to reflect on the ethical difficulties of trying to represent this crisis, not just in art, but in conversations with her own daughter and her partner's son. This paper suggests that, in her portrayal of both adult and child characters' growing understanding of the crisis, Lost Children Archive confronts these difficulties while challenging contemporary understandings of age and adult-child relationships in American writing. Now, intergenerational relationships and individuals' ages continue to be overlooked as inherently political and powerful aspects of identity. As Sari Elderstein and Melanie Dawson observe, quote, age seems to be such a natural, universal aspect of identity and social life that it can often pass as apolitical. But this illusion of neutrality is precisely what makes age so effective as a tool of ideology. Such an illusion embodies philosopher Byung-Chul Han's argument that, quote, power increases efficiency and stability by concealing itself, by presenting itself as something commonplace, something taken for granted, end quote. When interpreted in relation to age, his statement brings to light why intergenerational relationships must be scrutinized as vectors of power and its distribution. Indeed, in demonstrating the political power of age, Edelstein and Dawson reference the unknown number of children currently being held in US detention centers until their 18th birthdays so that they can be tried and imprisoned as adults for entering the country without documentation. Furthermore, age is viewed as justification for censoring dialogue between generations, including adult decisions that certain crises are not suitable to be discussed until an undetermined point of maturity has been achieved. Thus, Louis Elly's depictions of adults and young children as partners in dialogue speak to a progressive impulse to recognize children as individuals who should be treated with respect and intelligence and who should not be denied an understanding of the complex world we live in. Many of the novel's central discussions of the border crisis occur within the confines of the family car as they travel across country. In these instances, parents and children are presented as joined in dialogue and not prevented from accessing knowledge solely on the basis of age. Significantly, Louis Elly repeatedly presents Ma as always answering the children's questions concerning the border, including her own 5-year-old daughter's question of what does refugee actually mean, Mama? Later on, after the family witness an airplane deporting children take flight, and when the narrative voice changes to Ma's partner's 10-year-old son, Louis Elly writes, quote, I asked Ma what she thought was going to happen to the children in the airplane. She said she didn't know, but said if those lost children hadn't got caught the way they got caught, they would all have spread out across the country. They would have all gone somewhere to live in different houses, with different families. Gone to schools, I asked. Yes. And playgrounds? Yes. I asked Ma questions, and she answered. End quote. Such open intergenerational dialogue is central to Louis Elly's depiction of adult-child power dynamics. While thinking over the boy's question as to what would happen if he were lost and actually trapped inside William Golding's Lord of the Flies, Ma realizes that, quote, the more time one spends surrounded by children, the more their imaginations leak through the cracks of our own fragile structures, end quote. In this notable moment, Louis Elly addresses the mutable nature of intergenerational relationships. While adults presume a dominant position over children, children can also influence and alter adult perceptions and behaviours. Clementine Beauvais' Ato theory offers a valuable framework to identify and understand the ways in which adult-child relationships are mutable. Defined as the analysis of generational relationships in literature, Ato theory positions the central distinction between adult and child as a temporal otherness. That is to say, the fact that child and adult are symbolically set apart by their belonging to different temporalities, and that this difference modulates the distribution of powers between two categories. The child, according to Beauvais, is, quote, the owner of a longer future in which to act, while the adult is the owner of a longer time past with its accumulated baggage of experience, knowledge, etc., end quote. Finally, in defining the temporality of adult-child power dynamics, Beauvais argues that, quote, what one loses in might, one gains in authority. To be mighty is to have more time left. To be authoritative is to have more time past, end quote. Significant to Beauvais' understanding of adult-child power is her argument that neither party is stripped of it. Rather, they possess different forms. Furthermore, this power relationship is never static. While the mighty child may grow into an authoritative adult, the adult confronts their ever-decreasing authority. And thus a two-way power dynamic struggle is born and constantly navigated. In Lewis Ellie's innovative use of archival listings, we can observe her recognition of adult and children's varying levels of accumulated knowledge, or in Beauvais' term, authority. At the beginning of the novel, both parents are sound archivists, embarking on new projects, filling boxes of research materials to take on the road. Overhearing their parents' discussion, both children demand their own boxes too. Upon hearing that the children want to keep theirs empty in order to collect stuff on the way, Ma becomes frustrated, but eventually concedes so that, quote, in total, we had 7 boxes. They would travel with us, like an appendix of us, in the trunk of the car we were going to buy, end quote. Lewis Ellie then attributes archival listings to each of these 7 boxes and uses these listings to separate sections of the novel. If we turn to the listing for box 1, the first listing to be featured, we can see its formality and reliance upon pre-existing knowledge. Meanwhile, placed towards the end of the novel, the listing for the girl's box, box 6 on the right-hand side, demonstrates just how she has managed to collect knowledge during the experiences across the journey and across the novel. Using a polyvocal style, Lewis Ellie spells out the sounds, phrases, and experiences that the girl has collected. Ranging from the highly phonetic, such as tuk tick, crumbs falling on the car seat, to the more mimetic repetition of diner conversations, etc., it is clear that the youngest member of the family has created her own set of knowledge during the events of the novel. In this form of multimodality as well, the contrast between parents and children's boxes, Lewis Ellie gestures towards the inherent temporal difference between age groups, that the older has amassed time and therefore knowledge, while the younger anticipates a wealth of time and the knowledge waiting to be actively collected. Yet, by including both adult and child boxes and listings, Lewis Ellie suggests that these differences in both temporality and knowledge are equally valid and worthy of reading. We again see the adult narrator Ma's understanding of the mutable power relationship between adults and children as the family watch a plane of deported children take flight. Lewis Ellie writes, quote, "The only thing that parents can really give their children are little knowledges. This is how you cut your own nails. This is the temperature of a real hug. This is how I love you." Meanwhile, children force parents to go out looking for a specific pulse, a gaze, a rhythm, the right way of telling the story, knowing that stories don't fix anything or save anyone, but maybe make the world both more complex and more tolerable, and sometimes, just sometimes, more beautiful. Stories are a way of subtracting the future from the past, the only way of finding clarity in hindsight, end quote. The positioning of stories as a way of navigating time speaks to a late untimeliness which Peter Boxall observes in post-millennial writing that explores, quote, the discordance between newly passing time and the expired narratives with which we have made time readable, end quote. Lewis Ellie gestures towards this discordance when she writes that stories are a way of subtracting the future from the past. In this statement, Ma appears to realise that she can only really tell her own story by reflecting on her past rather than her children's future, for their future is their story to tell. Thus, participating dialogues with children have rendered her own time readable. And to return to Beauvais' ato-theoretical framework, the children's might have rendered her adult authority tangible. Here, we can observe Ma's consolidating awareness that, just as much as adults can give to children, children can also possess a commanding and significant power in adults' lives, namely provoking the search for the right way of telling a story. Notably, following this passage, Lewis Ellie changes narrative voice from the perspective of Ma to her partner's 10-year-old son, or simply the boy, for much of the remaining novel. While one could interpret this change as Lewis Ellie positioning a child's perspective as the right way of telling the story of the border crisis, I would suggest that she is instead redressing a lack of child perspectives in both literature and politics. After all, as observed earlier on in the novel, no media or stories of the border crisis, quote, seem to be covering the situation from the perspective of the children, end quote. By opposing the containment of this crisis, by totalizing adult voices in both mainstream media and her own novel, Lewis Ellie transforms the adult-child relationship into means of resistance against subordination. Indeed, this resistance takes a powerful form in Lewis Ellie's depictions of children at play. To elucidate how child's play in Lost Children Archive resists and subverts age hierarchies, I return briefly to Ma's narration earlier in the novel. Lewis Ellie writes, quote, "I listened to our two children playing in the back seat. Since learning about the border crisis, their games have become more vivid, more complex, more convincing. Children have a slow, silent way of transforming the atmosphere around them. Listening to them now, I realize they are the ones who are telling the story of the lost children. They've been telling it all along, over and over again in the back of the car for the past 3 weeks. But I hadn't listened to them carefully enough." End quote. Thus, in their imaginative play, Ma and Pa's children give voice to the lost children's journey far more consistently than either adult. This blurring of child's play and political storytelling also occurs when the boy learns to use a Polaroid camera to document the family's trip. In its reliance upon child agency and viewpoint, the boy's photography acts as another form of child perspective in the novel. Indeed, Lewis Ellie's decision to end the novel with a section devoted solely to photography further suggests that children's perspectives must be acknowledged by adult audiences. If we are to navigate moments of crisis together, and indeed that traditional novelistic conventions may be inadequate to fully redress this lack. Here we can see the final photo and final page of Lost Children Archive. It is a photo of Ma's daughter, with her gaze fixed to the camera, and by proxy, to the reader. Lewis Ellie's decision to conclude her novel with this image of a child's gaze is a final formal gesture towards the ways in which art can force us to reconsider adult-child relationships. As Beauvais argues, when quote, "caught in the look of the child, the adult is led to self-define not as the self who is, an already painful experience, but worse, as the self who was," end quote. Lewis Ellie's inclusion of the child's gaze and the absence of any written narration at this point ushers her reader towards the process of retrospective self-definition. Furthermore, they are asked to recognise adult-child relationships as steeped in power, rich with subversive possibilities, and as potential tools of political resistance amidst periods of crisis. Finally, and to conclude, I would like to say that while Lewis Ellie's novel draws upon accounts of the situation from around 2017-2018, the treatment of child refugees in the US must be recognised as an ongoing crisis. During the current COVID pandemic, 600 minors were deported from the US in April alone and denied the possibility of their cases entering immigration courts. This is a significant difference to what the Trump administration allowed before the pandemic. While produced at one point of this continuing crisis, Lewis Ellie's novel offers a rare and valuable literary representation of adults and children deepening their understanding of crisis and their own relationships. In demonstrating the validity and power of children's perspectives in times of crisis, Lewis Ellie ultimately asks her reader to recognise that children experience the same world and complexities as us adults, and that they are, quote, "our life partners in conversation, fellow travellers in the storm, with whom we strive constantly to find still waters," end quote. Thank you for listening. Cool.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Sorry, I know as chair, I should probably turn my mic on so that my clap is audible at least. But yeah.
I couldn't see anyone while I'm sharing the PowerPoint, so I was like, I hope everything's going okay. But cool. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Danielle. Okie dokes. We have one more panelist today before we proceed to a Q&A section. So it is now time for me to introduce Olivia Razan and her presentation, Heavy Waters, Heavy Meters, Poetry Responds to the Mediterranean Refugee Crisis. Olivia is a second-year PhD student in English at the University of Cambridge. Her research compares depictions of forced displacement in Romantic-era poetry to contemporary poetry about the refugee crisis. She has previously presented papers at the 2019 Cambridge Grad Conference, Responses to the Non-Human Turn, and the 2019 Cambridge Graduate Workshop, New Post-Colonial Concerns. She has also helped to convene the Cambridge Theory, Criticism and Culture Seminar from Easter 2019 to present. And she has an MA in Art and Politics from Goldsmiths, University of London, and a BA in English and Creative Writing from Barnard College, Columbia University. Olivia, we look forward to receiving your presentation.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much to the organizers for putting this conference together. That is both very timely in form and content. I'm just going to bring up my PowerPoint, so if you could also give me a thumbs up if you all see it, that would be wonderful. That's not what I wanted to do. Sorry, I don't think it's actually going to let me see if you guys are thumbsing up, so I'm just hoping that you see it. Anyway, thank you so much. So this presentation is called Heavy Waters, Heavy Meters. Poetry response to the Mediterranean refugee crisis. So what do I mean by the Mediterranean refugee crisis? In 2017, the International Organization for Migration wrote that Europe's Mediterranean border is by far the world's deadliest. The dangers of the crossing rose to mass public awareness in Europe during the so-called refugee crisis of 2014 to 2016, when more than 1.5 million people made the journey. 2016, as you can see in this chart, was also the deadliest year, with 5,096 people dying in the attempt. But both deaths and border crossings predate 2014, with at least 2,367,821 people making the trip between 1998 and 2017, and 33,761 people dying or going missing between 2000 and 2017. So it really, from the perspective of the people crossing, the dangers of the journey are an ongoing chronic crisis that began before 2014 and continue to this day. The main destinations for migrants crossing from the Middle East or Africa have been Greece and Italy, and this geographic fact has facilitated Anglophone writers and poets in drawing a comparison between contemporary refugees and migrants and the heroes of classical Greek and Roman epics. So, for example, Patrick Kingsley, who's a Guardian journalist, titled his book about the refugee crisis The New Odyssey, and wrote in his prologue that the contemporary refugee journey was, quote, almost as epic as that of classical heroes such as Aeneas and Odysseus, end quote. Both the classical characters and the contemporary refugees fled conflict in the Middle East by sailing across the Aegean, he argued. And he concluded with the quote that's up here on the PowerPoint: 3 millennia after their classical forebears created the founding myths of the European continent, today's voyagers are writing a new narrative that will influence Europe, for better or worse, for years to come. So what Kingsley makes very clear is that he is responding less to the meaning of the classical texts in their own context and more to what they've come to mean to the broader imagined community of Western Europe, and the shared sense of European identity as specific and is equally informed by Greco-Roman civilization, first emerged in the 18th and early 19th centuries as, please forgive my pronunciation here, Helge Vidar Holm, Cecil Langard, and Torgeir Skorgan point out in their introduction to The Borders of Europe, Hegemony, Aesthetics, and Border Poetics. This is also the same time that Romantic Hellenism emerged as a major cultural force. And so it is fitting that Kingsley's rhetorical strategies echo Percy Bysshe Shelley's in the preface to his poem Hellas, in which he urges European intervention in the Greek struggle for independence against the Ottoman Empire because, quote, we are all Greeks. Our laws, our literature, our religion, our arts have their root in Greece. So in both cases, the writers are trying to shame European readers and leaders into acting differently by appealing to the continent's claimed classical heritage. Shelley wants European powers to assist contemporary Greeks because their counterparts in antiquity essentially created European civilization, according to Shelley. Kingsley's comparison implicitly argues that the European Union should welcome refugees because they're like the characters the bloc claims as its founding heroes. Does it want to be among the monsters keeping Odysseus from Ithaca or Aeneas from Rome? Now, Kingsley is not unique in making this comparison in the contemporary context. Several Anglophone poets, including Ruth Padel, Ed Luker, Caroline Forché, and A.E. Stallings, have responded to Mediterranean border crossings with classical allusions. I'm only going to have time to talk about the first two today, but I wanted you to be aware that it is a broader trend in poetry that is responding to the refugee crisis. So at its worst, this approach risks repeating the problematic aspects of Romantic Hellenism, in which the current actors in the Mediterranean are given pathos through a Western European view of the region's past, rather than being engaged on their own terms. However, it also shares Romantic Hellenism's transformative potential. In the book Shelley in Greece, Rethinking Romantic Hellenism, Jennifer Wallace argues that radical thinkers like Shelley hoped that the study of ancient Greece would have a liberating effect on contemporary British society by showcasing the ways in which it was freer politically and religiously. So while Shelley in this particular instance is sort of saying that all of our laws have their root in Greece in order to sort of get Britain and other European powers to act in a certain way, overall he thought that British society fell far short of the promise of Greece, and by studying it in more depth, you could actually liberate British society and make it freer. So today, similarly, holding up the region's past can also have a transformative effect, as poets can demonstrate that the present borders are not inevitable, that they're historically constructed. So on the more problematic end of this scale is the work of Ruth Padel. So she wrote a book in 2012 called The Mara Crossing, which is a poetry prose meditation on all forms of migration. And in this book, Padel both reads the classics through the lens of contemporary immigration debates, and then reads those same debates through the lens of the classics. So her section on migration and history includes a translation of Book 4 of Virgil's Aeneid, in which Aeneas tells Dido why he must leave in very contemporary language. So the quote is here. He says, "You're Asian in a Libyan city. What's wrong with us Trojans finding a place in the sun? In Europe, don't we have a right to kingdom?" So in the original Latin, Virgil uses the word Ausonia, which means specifically Lower Italy. Further, as I have discussed, Europe did not really acquire its current meaning till the 18th century. The ancient Greeks, who originated the word, used it to refer to places that today would include both North Africa and Central Europe. Mythologically, it's also the name of a Phoenician princess. So by changing Aeneas's destination from a specific region to all of Europe as currently understood, transforms a historical intra-Mediterranean migration into a contemporary intercontinental one. It also translates the text into an anachronistic hierarchy. Europe is set apart with the M- as a place in the sun, to which Aeneas defensively insists he and his people have a right. Padel therefore unsettles a story of settling, recasting Aeneas not as a founding hero, but as an impoverished outsider, seeking, like countless other migrants, a more prosperous European home, a place in the sun. But by reinterpreting Aeneas as one of many Middle Eastern migrants seeking a better life in Europe, Padel also marks those migrants' journeys with the heroic. The founding father becomes an outsider, while the outsiders are revealed to be returning home. And this may sound positive, but I would argue that the danger of welcoming Middle Eastern or Asian migrants by way of the founding myths of the European continent is that it is a very Eurocentric greeting. It risks a sort of narcissism in which the poet looks into the sea and sees their own cultural references reflected back at them, rather than asking what the sea and the crossing might mean to those who experience it. The tendency to read the contemporary Mediterranean through a westernized ideal of its classical past was also deeply problematic during the Romantic period when that sort of idea of Europe as being linked by that past first emerged. This is something that Wallace acknowledges after Greece finally did win its independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1830, the conflict that Shelley wanted Europe to intervene in. The governing treaty of 1832 was written by representatives from Britain, France, Russia, and Bavaria, with no Greeks involved. And the new legal system was developed along Western European lines. So freedom, right? Anyway, so today the similarity of contemporary migrants to Aeneas or Odysseus can only be an argument for welcoming them into Fortress Europe if those figures are interpreted as part of European culture, not as people of their own time and context traversing a very different Mediterranean. But the comparison also relies on the assumption that the European project is one worth welcoming into rather than dismantling altogether. And when I say the European project here, I mean like sort of the broader, Europe as opposed to Asia and Africa and the global south, not the European Union versus Brexit, just to be clear. And maintaining Europe implies a non-Europe that will still remain outside. Making the suffering of migrants familiar in order to create sympathy suggests that sympathy could be denied if that suffering could not be domesticated. However, used judiciously, I think these illusions can do a different kind of work. That work can be explained through the emerging interdisciplinary field of border aesthetics, which concerns itself both with how borders are perceived in the physical environment and how they are represented in art and literature, with a view to, quote, questioning the practices that turn some realities into fictions and some fictions into prescriptions, end quote. That's Mirel Rossello and Stephen F. Wolf in their introduction to a collection on border aesthetics. Therefore, work that draws attention to the Mediterranean's past and how it came to be constructed can also undermine the prescriptive nature of its current identity as a border between Europe on one side and Africa and Asia on the other, to reveal that border as another fiction. So one poet who emphasizes the construction of the region's past in order to challenge its present is Ed Luker in his poetry-prose hybrid Heavy Waters, which confronts the triple crises of refugees risking their lives to cross the Mediterranean, the 2008 financial crisis that devastated Greece in particular, and the rise of the far right. Its second section is a personal essay about the trip the poet made to Greece, and it includes this very telling reference to its classical past. So here's the quote up on the slide. Passing through these zones, the outskirts of the city, I reached the tourist's target, the city center, ancient Athena, a place that exists in my imagination as much through Keats's rumination on pots and fragments sequestered in the British Museum as it does through images of police being bombarded with Molotovs in Syntagma Square. So here Luker is very clear that his idea of ancient Greece is constructed by 19th century myth-making, inseparable from an imperial project, hence the reference to the British Museum sequestering things. And he undermines this sort of vision with humor. So Keats' vaunted Grecian urn becomes a pot. A few sentences later, he talks about being hungry and having to piss while wandering the ruins advertised as, quote, the birthplace of thought. But he also places himself in an alternative tradition. As Shelley looked at classical Greece as an example of a freer society, Luker also looks to the past for a through line of liberation. A visit to the temple of Hephaestus, god of metalwork and fire, leads him to reflect on work as alienation and the fact that both Shelley and Marx were inspired by the figure of Prometheus. He is seemingly inspired too, because immediately afterwards he attempts his own transgressive theft by, quote, leaping over some fences to see if I can sneak up to the Acropolis, unquote, without paying. The theft also reads like a failed version of an illegal border crossing. So here's his description. After triumphantly crossing over a few gates, I realize I have only got closer to nowhere, all limbs and clambering awkwardness. It's the moment where you try and get over the top that really troubles me, suspended over the imminent doom of a blunt pull. The official perimeter is patrolled by private security and the old motorcycle police officer. Embarrassed, I feebly give up and sort of pry at the Acropolis from the distance of the toll gates. So Luker's account is comic and self-deprecating. The initial triumph of his attempt is ironically undercut by his inability to get anywhere, and his almost slapstick description of himself as awkward, embarrassed, and feeble. At the same time, the passage occurs in a larger poetry collection that takes as one of its central concerns the Mediterranean as border crossing. In that context, it is hard not to see the echoes of the migrant's journey in the speaker's attempt on the Acropolis. Like the migrants, he confronts both physical barriers and state security, the provision of which is often privatized. Unlike the migrants, he lets those obstacles stop him. He falls short of the transgressive heroism of Prometheus as read through Shelley, but the migrants by implication do not. Taken as a whole, the sequence reveals and deconstructs the founding myths of the European continent to emphasize that something less exclusionary could be crafted to replace them. The migrants become the potential protagonists of this transformation, the Promethean figures bearing a fire that could burn down the borders surrounding that myth and light the way towards a, quote, vagrant earth, to quote one of the verse sections in this book, that belongs to, quote, all or none. I'm just leaving out the section that those quotes are from here because I think it's a beautiful passage, and it sort of emphasized Lueker's ultimate vision, I think, of sort of solidarity through vulnerability, that I think he's sort of using to kind of undermine this sort of idea of Europe as this sort of special place based on this kind of imagined cultural strength. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you'll have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much, Livia. Another really interesting presentation. And now the time comes for us to have about 15 minutes. So we'll be running until about 2:15 to ask some questions. So at this point, I would like to open it up to everybody attending. I will say that if you are going to ask a question, please let me know. Probably the easiest way to do it is by popping a short message on the chat or question, and I will come to you, at which point I would ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question. Please indicate which of the panelists that question is for, or if it is for all of the panelists. Yes, alternatively, you can type your question out in the chat box if you'd like me to ask it. But yeah, ideally it would come from you. That would be nice. So yes, I'll open it out just now and see if anybody would like to ask a question. I don't mind kicking things off with a question. So actually, I would like to, we have a question, right. Well, I will come back to my one. Elena, would you like to ask your question, please?
Hello, hi. So yeah, that was really interesting. Thank you for all of those talks. Yeah, I'd like to ask Daniela Nunziata about the, with the language. I thought it was very interesting. And I was wondering about the role of dialect and how both the kind of Turkish and Greek communities have their own dialect, which is different from the standard Greek and Turkish. And in particular with the Greek, the way that the kind of Cypriot Greek can't be written using the standard Greek alphabet because of the way that the dialect is structured. So there's that kind of orality to it, which kind of changes the way that literature can be used as a medium. And also the way that currently kind of a lot of Greek Cypriots use the Latin alphabet to write in kind of Greeklish, or to write the Cypriot way of speaking, because that is actually easier than the Greek alphabet to write it. So I was wondering if you had any more to say about that.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Hajsto Baraboli, for that question. Yeah, I think it's definitely really important. It's something that features heavily in my research. Really kind of struggling for time today to really engage with it, but it's one of those kind of issues about the Cypriot context which kind of brings to the forefront why these linguistic concerns are so important for cultural practitioners grappling with these kinds of cultural, political, and existential crises. And yeah, I mean, there's so much to be said. I mean, I think firstly, there's something quite interesting about the fact that this relationship with dialect happens at the moment on both sides of the border, as you point out, that the presence of Cypriot Greek and Cypriot Turkish, or Gibriaga and Kupruzlaja. And so that's something that interestingly Cypriots have in common regardless of where they live on the partitioned island, and yet is something that creates new obstacles and difficulties when it comes to creating cultural works that can be easily disseminated. And yes, certainly one of the issues is kind of this relationship between oral forms and written forms. How do Cypriot writers create written forms that can then sort of grapple with appropriate, challenge dominant discourses. And so I think for some Cypriot writers, using English, using standard modern Greek, and using standard modern Turkish are ways of directly engaging with those linguistic spheres at the expense of not doing due justice to representing kind of the authentic vernaculars of everyday Cypriot life. And I think it's this really difficult tension that Cypriot writers, are faced with, and a really kind of difficult dilemma in terms of which language to use. And so, of course, going back to this word crisis, in order to respond to these political crises to do with nationalism, often, as is the case in modern Cyprus, Cypriots are constantly going through a very personal crisis about which language they should use, whether they should use English or, say, Greek and Turkish. And indeed, if they choose to reject English, how do they integrate Cypriot Greek and Cypriot Turkish into kind of written mass media productions? And so I don't have any kind of straightforward answers for that, only kind of just observations that I hope are kind of entering into our discussion here. Yeah, I mean, I think also your observation about the kind of the Greeklish and the way in which Cypriot Greek is sometimes transliterated in Roman script is something that's really fascinating. It also happens with Cypriot Arabic as well. So there's a much smaller community of Cypriots who speak Arabic and have done for many generations, and that's a language that has never really been transliterated. And even now there's kind of slow attempts to do so, and doing so through the Roman script often. And even less so through the Greek script, which has been this really fascinating process of a Semitic language, which is a dialect of Arabic, or belongs to one of those many languages, then entering into the transcripted forms of English and Greek. So I think there's so much going on in Cyprus in terms of language, in terms of the relationship between oral vernaculars, which have this sort of, and it's a word that I shy away from often, but something that's authentic in terms of representing everyday life, but then also this kind of attempt to mediate with the dominant discourses of English, Greek and Turkish. And so, as I was saying before, I think, again, this word crisis is really useful because of this linguistic, this personal, this cultural crisis that Cypriot writers face in struggling to find the best literary medium to compose, anti-colonial or anti-nationalist works. So I hope that does some justice to those really, really important questions. And I thank you again for those questions, if I start.
And yeah.
Hello. I had a question to Danielle Cameron about her paper. All superb papers. Thank you very much. I had my camera and microphone off. I was applauding raucously, I assure you. It was really great. Especially the stuff of Ato theory. Is it Ato theory? I hadn't heard of that before, and it's especially this. I wanted to talk a bit more. I suppose actually ask you if you could talk a bit more about this. It's a quote that you took from Byung-Chul Han, or how power increases efficiency and stability by concealing itself. And I was wondering if you'd thought more about like kind of concealment and revelation in relation to your work, and how, in terms of, you very much talk about opening up an intergenerational discourse, and how it seems to be adults, I think from what I've understood, are concealed somewhat from children, have to kind of re-engage with their past. And that speaks to so much stuff today in terms of, Frederick Jameson's theories about how we're in a perpetual present, and maybe that's part of why, we have such an issue of intergenerational communication. It's a temporal issue. And I was just wondering if you could maybe, I don't know if you'd considered stuff about concealment and revelation, and if you could maybe expand on that a bit more, because I found that incredibly interesting. And thank you again.
Thank you. I would say I'm not explicitly engaged with notions of concealment and revelation, but I think that is implicit in a lot of what my work does, which is, particularly the work I've done over the past year, is kind of revealing the norm of the adult. So this kind of temporal normativity. As children, we are constantly kind of like pushing towards these next like temporal landmarks, like you're going to turn 16, that's cool, we're going to turn 18, we can vote, we can drink, let's go. But when you enter into the adult norm, suddenly you presume this position of power, and a lot of my work is about that kind of retrospective revelation of the adult is just as constructive as the child. So the notion of adult power is relying upon cultural constructions that are so taken for granted. And I do find it interesting when I have presented my work before, and when I talk to people about my work, age is such a universally experienced thing. Of course, it intersects with so many different aspects of identity, but when we talk about gender, class, race, age also underlies a lot of how we experience prejudice and like can assume positions of power, if that makes sense. I don't want to be repetitive, but yes, I think really what to take away is like just excavating and revealing the normativities of adulthood as a temporal stage is something that can enrich a lot of our reading of all different kinds of writing, not just contemporary, but I do think it plays a lot into the contemporary discourses around protest movements right now. So in the news, we see images of youth leading this movement, and yet in kind of quote unquote normal times, youth are often seen as a disposable, overlooked sector of society. So yeah, it's kind of like taking childhood off its pedestal and putting it with adulthood as these constructs, and how do we unpick them? I hope that answers the question.
That's fantastic, and I'm really interested to see where you go with work like this. It's great.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. I have a question for Olivia, which is really I'm interested in, do you find whether or not, in terms of the sort of crossings that you've been thinking about and seeing depicted by some poets, do you find that, and then the tendency to reach for like classical allusions there, or the sort of the comparisons that can be made, do you find writers who have made that journey, who have traveled that distance, or come from, been displaced and come to Europe, picked up those sources in art at all? Because I just think about whether or not, as a kind of diasporic writer, whether or not there would be a tension there to pick up the sort of the canon of the place at which you arrive, versus perhaps a canon that is not recognized in that place but is very much your kind of home. And I just wondered whether or not that's a tension that you'd seen arising with any writer, or if indeed any writers are, how they're choosing to document that journey at all.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. From what I have seen, I have not seen people either who have made that journey, or maybe people, like there are writers who might necessarily not have actually crossed the Mediterranean as migrants, but are from, immigrant communities that share a background with some of the migrants, or people from Syrian immigrant communities, or poets writing in the Middle East, or people responding to this from a different tradition and background. I have, unfortunately, am not able to access as much of that work as there is because I don't speak Arabic. So that's sort of a blind spot. But from what I've read, that's either translated, or there's a book that was put out called England Poems from a School, which is all like migrant children in the UK writing poems in English. The references actually tend to be to the home country language, and I haven't seen literature as much, but definitely to language and geographical features and things that are missed from the home. So the emphasis is much more on that. And like one really interesting poem about sort of the sea crossing, and I don't think the poet is actually a refugee, but she's sort of writing from the point of view of a refugee, and it's written as a ghazal, or ghazal, which is like an Arabic poem form, and it makes use of the fact that the word for meter and sea in Arabic is the same. So that's sort of the reference that is used more, is to the home culture than to the culture that they're arriving in, from what I have seen anyway. So
thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you very much. We probably have time for one final question, if anybody has one. All right, Amy, fire ahead.
Hi guys, thank you so much for these really interesting presentations. I'm actually from the Education and Psychology department, so it's really nice to be invited to a different discipline and different conferences. But my question is, I think that the work that you're doing is so influential and very special. I really enjoyed Danielle Cameron's presentation of looking or bridging the gap between the older generation and the children and sharing that creativity and imaginative side. But I'm wondering, maybe a question for all of you is like, how are you hoping that your work is going to make impact? I think it's so essential that it gets disseminated as quick as possible in this very timely moment. But do you have any ideas where your research is actually going to go, or how you hope to, disseminate it for this period?
All right. Yeah, would anybody like to jump in on that one first of all?
Hi, I'll jump in. So in terms of where is it going? So obviously my discipline is literature, but I am very influenced by sociological thought. I actually I did an MPhil in the education fac a few years ago, looking at children's literature and the kind of power structures existing in there. And I'm like using terminology I learned in that discipline into writing for adults, so particularly postmodernism and how the child has been overlooked as this like vector of power and political kind of momentum in authors that have previously been received as apolitical. So if you look at Austen and DeLillo, we're seeing very like stylistic Ludic authors, but actually they always talk about children in rather conservative ways. So really, in terms of disseminating where I see it going forward, it is just excavating the politics of highly stylized authors and saying that these cycles of age normativity are occurring again and again, and what does this mean? And just broadening that out to wider discourses of literature, if that makes sense. Anybody else would like to go?
Yeah, any sort of brief thoughts?
I suppose I could go. I mean, I think I have kind of similar thoughts to Danielle there in terms of just attempting to put this research forward and to kind of complicate existing debates further still. I mean, I suppose going back to the question that Eleanor asked me before, a lot of those kind of questions about linguistic form and literary form on the island are certain questions and debates that I'm wanting to grapple with and ask more questions about. Cyprus is obviously a very small place, and I think it's really interesting that a lot of creative writers from the island are also both political activists and also academics. They kind of work in teaching, pedagogy, in universities, and so I think just any way in which I can kind of interject my research into this existing community of voices that kind of bridge these disciplines between creative writing and teaching, and also aspects of activism against the existing partition of the island. Any way that I can be involved in that and use my research to participate in that would be extremely important for me, I think. And yeah, I think any way to kind of further these existing acts of dialogue and collaboration to kind of put pressure on the existing border on the island, and to hopefully do something in the way of helping to arrive at a kind of a future without partition on the island, and indeed with kind of fewer nationalist partitions, lines of partition, real or imagined, across the world. Any way that research can help with that is something that I would very much be happy about. I hope that doesn't sound too idealistic, but yeah, I think it'd be nice if research has some kind of practical application, and as I was saying in my paper, that's why I'm so kind of keen on things like collaboration and any ways that we can kind of interact together in order to help each other to try and have some sort of positive impact on the world. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Olivia, any thoughts?
Yeah. So actually, I think that perhaps idealistically, my goal would be something close to what Daniela just said about sort of undermining the legitimacy of borders and these sort of lines between refugees and economic migrants and settled citizens, and the kind of linking of citizenships to rights as like the only thing that grants you rights is, being part of a nation. My whole project is comparing depictions of forced displacement in Romantic era poetry to contemporary poetry dealing with the refugee crisis. And I think that the reason I took it on was partly because I was reading all these poems in sort of Romantic period about people being displaced even like around the English countryside, even, you know, people displaced because of hunger or war or whatever it was. And this is around the time that Brexit was starting, and the impulse was really like, well, this time where like so much of your iconic poetry was written, actually, like the idea that England is a settled place was very much in flux, and people were wandering around and forced to wander around in the same way that people are now forced to come here. So it was ultimately trying to undermine this idea that England, or indeed any country, is sort of a settled place, as opposed to some other part of the world where things are inherently mobile. So that's sort of hopefully what I can undermine. But the coronavirus has kind of changed things, because it did feel like things were getting more mobile, and with the climate threat, more people were going to be coming, and now things are getting even more clamped down because of the pandemic. And I don't really know how that's going to play out. You know, refugees are even more vulnerable now because they're stuck in these camps, and where the virus can spread, or like in the U.S. context, you know, people are in these detention centers. So I don't really know how that's all going to play out with what's happening now.
Right. Thank you very much. So I will draw things to a close there. Thanks once again to all speakers. A wee round of applause, perhaps. Great stuff. Thank you. We've really enjoyed all of your presentations today. What I would say to any attendees who are interested to explore further these topics that have been raised, and we'll be sending out shortly bibliographies, short bibliographies from each of the speakers, with some texts that you might look up if you'd like to read a little bit more about any of the topics. I point you towards our next panel tomorrow, Capitalism in Crisis. If you've not registered for that already, you can do so, and we look forward to seeing you there. Otherwise, all that's left for me is to thank once again all of our speakers, and to wish you all a great rest of your day. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.